Well, welcome to the fourth session of the Money Talks. In my early 20s, I graduated in marketing from the Uni of New South Wales and got a job in the TNT Group. Now, the TNT Group was one of the big premier companies in that time, so I was working in one of the divisions. This was kind of in the early 80s. I was assistant to the national sales manager. He was still a young guy in his mid-30s, very successful, really kind of in the cut and thrust of sales and so on. He really did treat me well. And I think he was trying to educate me one day about how to kind of cope in the company culture. And he said to me, "Alan, I want to tell you a story and you'll get it." Okay, so let me tell you the story. He says this. He said, imagine as a man walks into a bar and sits down near a beautiful woman. And he says to the woman, "Madam, I wonder if you would sleep with me for $1 million. She said, "Oh, $1 million. Yes, I would." He said, "Uh-huh. Would you sleep with me for 50? She says, "Certainly not. What do you think I am?" He said, "Now, we've established that. What we're doing is bargaining." I said, And he said to me, "So, Alan, remember, we all have our price. Just make sure that yours is a good one." And his point being that everything's for sale if the price is right. And he was right in the way as I looked around the company culture, because what I saw there is men, and in the 80s it was mostly men, who had sold their souls to the company and put all sorts of other relationships kind of behind that and worked to climb the ladder. And after a time, you do that long enough, things at home are so bad that you actually want to spend more time at work, and so you end up selling your soul to the company and there's nothing else left. But you know what? It was okay because, hey, they'd become wealthy, they'd climbed the ladder, they were senior managers and so on. They had status at work. You know, as a society, and I think often as individuals, we say relationships is what matters most, and yet we behave like everything has a price. As we come to the fourth of the rich men in Luke's Gospel, we actually see that. Jesus meets a man who had sold his relationships, sold his soul really for money, possessions and the status that brings. To put it into context, ever since chapter 9, Jesus has been on his way to Jerusalem. He started way up north in Galilee and he's walked the 100 or more kilometres on his way to Jerusalem. It's chapter 19, he's about to arrive. In fact, as Jesus walks into Jericho, he's only 27 kilometres from Jerusalem. And he's on his way there, he knows he'll be crucified. And so Luke tells us this day, Luke chapter 19 verse 1, Jesus entered Jericho and was passing through. Jericho is a major trading centre and also a major tax collection centre. They went together. There was money to be made and taxes to be paid. And then Luke tells us, verse 2, a man was there by the name of Zacchaeus. He was a chief tax collector and was wealthy. I looked it up. The experts tell me that the name Zacchaeus means clean or innocent. And I bet he was, as his mum held him. "Oh, isn't he sweet? We'll call him Zacchaeus." And yet, things had worked out very differently. See, I don't know if we get it today, but to be a tax collector is not just like, working for the Australian Tax Department today. To be a tax collector then was to be hated. Why? Because the occupying Roman army was very clever. They actually got the Jewish men to take on the role of collecting taxes for the Romans. And the tax collectors would collect taxes from their own people and take as much as possible, and a whole lot of it went into their own pockets. They were despised, and rightly so. And so this man Zacchaeus no doubt had become very rich. You notice Luke says he was a chief tax collector. I suspect that probably means that he had people subcontracted to him to do the job. And so he'd become very rich. So we find out later he was short. Right? He was a short man. So you think short, wealthy, hard, in your face. If you want to get him in your head, here's the man to think of. He's a kind of a first century Danny DeVito, all right? And there've been great advantages. Sure, it had cost him, but he was rich. He had status. As we were saying in the last session, he had, well, you might not call it love, but he had the respect of the world around him. But he'd ignored or really sold the relationships. Right? He'd sold relationships and respect and the love of people and so on for status. What a fool, really, wasn't he? He'd actually sold his soul for money. Stupid. And yet, you know, as you look, our society's doing that more and more too. We're actually selling our soul for money and stuff in different ways, not just as individuals, but in the way we structure our society. Now, one of the voices that speaks about this and makes great sense is Ross Gittins, who writes for the Sydney Morning Herald. I'd like to read to you part of an article that Ross Gittins wrote 4th of April 2012 about the way that we're selling our soul. Listen to what Ross Gittins says. He says, whether or not they realise what they're doing, Australia's business people, economists and politicians are in the process of dismantling the weekend and phasing out public holidays. And they're doing it in the name of making us better off. And we're the land of the long weekend, in theory, and yet we're about to phase out weekends and public holidays. How? Ross Gittins outlines, I won't read the whole article, but he outlines that historically penalty rates, having to pay people more to work on those days, has actually stopped business creeping into the public holidays and weekends. But taking away penalty rates will make it possible. He says this, last week the New South Wales government moved to join Victoria in allowing all shops, not just those in the CBD, to open on Boxing Day. Now, say the retailers, all we need is for restrictions to be lifted on Easter Sunday. And this week, the major banks revealed their intention to push for the definition of ordinary hours in the National Banking Award to be extended to include Saturday afternoons and all of Sundays. Those people who work for banks? Yay, that's great, isn't it? Now, what's the bank's justification for seeking such a change? They say to promote, quote, flexible and efficient modern work practices in a way that has proper regard to the considerations of productivity and employment costs. Ah, yes, it would make the economy more flexible and efficient and thus raise productivity. Well, in that case, say no more. Silly me. He continues, it's not hard to see why there's so little public questioning of this push towards 24/7 economy. It's highly convenient to be able to shop whenever we have time. The more two-income families we have, the more we value the ability to shop throughout the weekend. It also fits the trend towards leisure being commercialised, being something we buy, a meal out, a show, rather than something we do, kick a football at the park with the kids. But this belief that life would be better if shops, restaurants and places of entertainment were open all hours rests on the assumption that you and I won't be among those required to work unsociable hours and make it happen. An even less obvious assumption is that the push for a 24/7 economy will stop when it's captured shopping and entertainment. We assume that it won't continue and reach those of us who work in factories or offices. As usual, the flexibility being sought is one-sided. Employers gain the ability to require people to work or not work, at times to suit their firm's efforts to maximise its profits. Here's a good question he asks. Why does being able to buy more stuff make up for husbands and wives being able to see less of each other, having less time with the kids, having a lot more trouble getting together with your friends, and having your day off when everybody else is at school or working? Why is this an attractive future? Why should our elected representatives reorganise our economy in ways that suit business and promote consumption, but do so at the expense of employees' private lives? It's a classic case of business people, economists and politicians urging on us a mentality that prioritises the economic and the material over other dimensions of our lives. Yet again, no one pauses to ask what these reforms will do to our relationships. I guess I'd say we keep electing politicians who want to do this. We're doing it to ourselves. So what's Ross Gittins saying? We are in grave danger as a society of having, if you like, full pockets and empty lives. Now, as I did some research for this talk, I actually found an article that says exactly that. It's an American psychiatrist who's investigated this, and his article is called Full Pockets and Empty Lives, a psychoanalytic exploration of contemporary culture of greed. Big name for the article. And the man, Paul Wachtel, as you can see, he has a big moustache. Now, it's an interesting article, but that is one serious moustache. It's an American study. I bought it online, actually paid money to get it. It's a huge thing, and I've read it all. Let me give you the heart of it. What he says is, and it's a good question, he's trying to work out why people, in his words, why so many people pursue single-minded economic goals, or why people absolutely single-mindedly about more and more money, when study after study shows that more stuff doesn't make you happier. So psychological study after psychological study, it doesn't make you happier, so why do we do it? That's what he's trying to work out. Now, he goes through a whole lot of research which shows pretty much common sense, and that is, when you stop and think, the research shows people don't stop and think. Yeah? Right? Common sense isn't common. He talks about a number of interesting things in the article. He talks about the King Midas touch. You know the Midas story, everything he touched turned to gold? He says this, but the insight in the Midas story points to what we might call the tragedy of insatiability. The greedy individual may be morally reprehensible, but he is also likely to be unable to achieve genuine contentment or satisfaction. Indeed, one of my central interests is to understand the difference between the individual who strives restlessly but does experience satisfaction as a result, and the individual for whom insatiability is a curse, for whom the desire for money and wealth is a hunger that cannot be slaked. I wonder as a society how we'd recognise insatiability. He goes on to say, our society offers shopping as a solution to feelings of emptiness, worthlessness, depressed mood and so forth. Do you know, as I'm walking around the giant shopping malls where I live in Sydney, apart from that kind of funny feeling in the back of my head, will I ever be able to find my car again? What hits me is the way they're lit, the way they feel, the indoor space, the sound. It actually feels like a cathedral. It's almost like this place you go to worship. There's almost an otherworldly feel. He goes on to say, for many Americans, and I'm so close here I think, for many Americans, however, success is defined materialistically. Money and possessions are sought very largely as an end in themselves and serve as the validator of their worth and the definer of the needs and desires. Indeed, so widespread is this feature of American subjectivity that some readers may wonder why I'm bothering to state it at all. The sky is blue, the grass is green, and people like to have more money. What else is new? Or in Australian terms, oh, duh. All right. Now, one last thing he says. What is less likely to be clearly perceived is that the way that members of our society organise their lives in pursuit of these continually escalating consumption standards are not always beneficial to their relationships or their children. This is what Ross Gittins was saying. It's perhaps the guilt or shame they feel in the unacknowledged recognition that their children often pay a price for what their parents need to maintain their own self-esteem in a highly competitive society that accounts for the great American, and I would say Australian mantra, I'm doing this for my family. No one says to himself or herself, I think I'll validate myself and hold myself together with money. What I'm describing is something that goes on unconsciously, further adding to the dismay and internal pressure to have more money. And then here's the quote the quote that was worth the price of the article. The quest for more and more money and material goods fills a hunger, I'd say actually doesn't quite fill a hunger, fills a hunger that comes from elsewhere. It is the task of psychological analysis to discover from where that hunger comes. And so he says, let me read that first sentence there. The quest for more and more money and material goods fills a hunger that comes from elsewhere. It's the task of psychological analysis to discover from where that hunger comes. And so he says we have to invite more voices into the study. You know, the voices of sociology and economics and history and as I read it, I noticed there was one voice missing, but we'll come to his voice. And so in Australia, we push for more and more. Now, Richard Denness, who was on the City Bible Forum panel about this, Richard Denness and Clive Hamilton, in their book Affluenza. I'm not sure if they're great academics, I think they are, but I certainly think they're good-looking men. In 2005, Australia was working the highest, on average, we were working the highest number of working hours in the whole of the OECD. With the land of the long weekend, and we were working 4 hours a week on average, more than the USA, working more than the USA, and 4 hours a week more than all the average of the countries. We're working ourselves to death. And they go on to say in the middle of the book, the huge effects on our health and our families, anxiety, substance abuse, alcoholism, and so on. They say many couples' decisions about whether or not to have children are based on commercial/financial, actually lifestyle considerations. I mentioned in an earlier session the ComSec report that says we're now building the biggest houses and apartments in the world, the biggest new houses in the world on average. You know, when I was a kid, the great aspiration was to have a ride-on lawnmower. In some of the suburbs in Sydney, they now have ride-on vacuum cleaners. Right? Giant houses that, guess what, sit empty while we go and work incredible hours to pay for the giant houses. We become time poor, relationally poor. It's because it's that insatiability that we think this hunger will be met by having more and more stuff. What is it Paul Watchtel said? The quest for more and more money and material goods fills a hunger that comes from elsewhere. Where? In the 5th century, think back with me, the 5th century, the Christian Augustine, St. Augustine, wrote his autobiography called The Confessions. It's a very famous line. He said this: God, you have made us for yourself, and our hearts are restless till they find their rest in you. God, you have made us for yourself, and our hearts are restless till they find their rest in you. And you know, I think, let's go back to the Zacchaeus story. I think that little hard, aggressive man, I think he felt that restlessness. And no doubt as a little boy, he'd been taken to the synagogue and he'd been taught the Old Testament, and he realised that he had lived his life ignoring his most important relationship with his Creator. And life was empty. And he also realised that there would be a judgment day. There would be a day when his Creator would demand an accounting for what he'd done with the life he'd been given. And so that restlessness meant that he wanted to see this young teacher or prophet from Galilee as he travelled through Jericho. And so we're told, Luke chapter 19, verse 3, he wanted to see who Jesus was, but being a short man, he could not because of the crowd. And so he ran ahead and climbed a sycamore fig tree to see him, since Jesus was coming that way. Now, do you know, I've known this story for decades, but I don't think I ever really understood it till I got past 50. Here's the great news flash, all right? And if you're over 50, you'll understand, but if you're still young, middle-aged men don't climb trees, okay? When you're a kid, you do it all the time. I can't remember the last time I climbed a tree. Middle-aged men do not climb trees. Why? Well, one is it gets more and more difficult as gravity gets a bit stronger, if you know what I mean, but also it's embarrassing. Now, the tree that he climbs would probably suit a middle-aged man. A sycamore fig tree, it's got low lateral branches that even, an old guy could climb. And so it's embarrassing. He has to swallow his pride, but he does it. It's interesting, isn't it, that wanting to see and find out about Jesus can still be embarrassing today. I've known many men and women that it's been kind of difficult, embarrassing. Cross the line, do it. It's worth it. So this hard, world-weary man with a lot of enemies swallows his pride, climbs the tree. We get to verse 5. When Jesus reached the spot, he looked up and said to him, Zacchaeus, come down immediately. I must stay at your house today. Now, I don't know whether this is a supernatural thing, that it's kind of some divine appointment, that Jesus knows his name, calls him down. It could be. It could also be that Jesus, perceptive man that he is, walking along, you see a well-dressed middle-aged guy climb a tree, you can think, this man probably needs to talk. And what's his name? Calls him down. It could be either. So he came down at once and welcomed him gladly. Right. Verse 7, all the people saw this, the crowd travelling with Jesus. All the people saw this and began to mutter, he's going to be the guest of a sinner. And what's Jesus doing? To eat with someone, particularly in the first century Middle Eastern culture, to eat with someone is to accept them as a friend, just to kind of accept them as a person. And this man, Zacchaeus, has lived his life outside of kind of polite society, outside of the religious rules of Israel. He's a sinner. Religion says you stay away from those people. And yet Jesus consistently welcomed people to him. So the crowd is scandalised that Jesus would go and eat with him. But see the change in Zacchaeus. See verse 8. But Zacchaeus stood up. Now, I don't know when this happened. It may have been as soon as he came down from the tree, but it may well have been after lunch, after they've talked to one another. But Zacchaeus stood up and said to the Lord, "Look, Lord, here and now I give half of my possessions to the poor. And if I've cheated anybody out of anything, I'll pay back 4 times the amount." Do you notice what Zacchaeus calls Jesus? Look, Lord. Lord or Master. So what is it? Here's the great change. Zacchaeus has actually come now to acknowledge Jesus as his Lord or his Master. That's what he calls him. And there's all the difference in the world, right, in that change. If you watch session 3 where we looked at the rich young ruler, do you remember what the rich young ruler calls Jesus? He comes to Jesus and says, "Good teacher." One calls him teacher, the other calls him Lord. All the difference in the world. Jesus says, we looked in session 3 about the rich young ruler, Jesus says it's actually impossible for a rich man to come into the kingdom of God by actually humbling himself and trusting Jesus. It's impossible, and yet God can do that miracle. And here, Zacchaeus stands up, and God has done that miracle with this hard little man. Now, Luke gives the story shorthand. If we had time to take the whole of Luke's gospel and, if you like, pour it into this story, there's 3 things that Zacchaeus has come to know. Let me tell you the 3 things. First thing is this. Zacchaeus has come to know that he's accepted and loved by God. See, the message is not get your act together, live a really good life, and maybe God will accept you. The answer is no. God accepts sinners. God accepts people who've done the wrong thing. Come, not get your life in order, but come have Jesus as your Lord, and he will begin to put your life in order. First thing, he's accepted by God. Second thing, he's forgiven. He's forgiven. Because you see, what Zacchaeus has done is very serious. Very serious. Now, I don't mean extortion, fraud, theft. They're bad. But what Zacchaeus has done is much worse than that. Zacchaeus has spent his life breaking the greatest commandment. And what's the greatest commandment? Jesus says the greatest commandment is to love God with all your heart, soul, mind and strength. To love the one who gives us life itself with our life, with everything we have. And Zacchaeus has ignored him. And he deserves actually to be sent from the presence of God for eternity. And yet, instead of that, he's freely forgiven. Now, it's free for Zacchaeus and for you, for me, if we'll accept it. It costs Jesus. As I said earlier, Jesus is now 27 kilometres from Jerusalem, 27 kilometres away from paying the price. Paying the price that's necessary for forgiveness. Accepted by God, forgiven by God because Jesus has paid the price. And thirdly, has accepted Jesus as Lord and so can begin to fix up his life. Right? To put life back into the way that it should be. Notice verse 8, Zacchaeus stood up and said to the Lord, "Look, Lord, here and now I give half of my possessions to the poor. And if I've cheated anybody out of anything, I'll pay back 4 times the amount." So what's he trying to do? To make restitution, to be generous, right? Half of my possessions to the poor, to be generous, to make restitution. Why 4 times the amount? Well, I think where it comes from is this. In the law of Israel, in Exodus chapter 22, in the Old Testament law, if you stole a sheep and you were caught, so you've stolen the sheep and then there's a knock at the door and you've got the lamb roast in the oven and wearing the Ugg boots or whatever. If you're caught, you actually had to pay back 4 times the amount. You had to pay back 4 sheep. I think that's what it is. So what Zacchaeus doing is bringing even his own money under the lordship of Jesus. Right? He's living that way. Isn't it interesting that if you look at the rich young ruler in chapter 18, he gives up nothing and walks away sadly. Zacchaeus gives up so much and yet welcomes Jesus gladly. Why? Because where Jesus is, there's joy. Now, how would you like Jesus to get his hands on your life? All right? What would he change? And it might be a bit painful, but I guarantee it'd be the best thing that ever happened. What would Jesus say about money and so on? Let me just give you one quick quote. The Apostle Paul, as he writes to his young lieutenant Timothy about how rich people and what they should do and so on. The Bible says more about money than just in Luke's Gospel. Let me read to you what Paul says to Timothy in chapter 6. I'll read from verse 17. Paul says this: "Command those who are rich in this present world not to be arrogant," easily done, isn't it? "Nor to put their hope in wealth, which is so uncertain, but to put their hope in God, who richly provides us with everything for our enjoyment." He's saying, don't trust your wealth and so on. Trust God for your security, for your status. And notice, God gives us things for our enjoyment. When you trust God, you're actually able to sit much lighter to the things that you own and actually enjoy them more. He says, command them, that's the rich, command them to do good, to be rich in good deeds, and to be generous and willing to share. See, the way that you know that you own your possessions rather than your possessions owning you is that you're able to be generous and willing to share. And notice the last verse: "In this way they'll lay up treasure for themselves as a firm foundation for the coming age, so that they may be able to take hold of the life that is truly life." It's actually as you follow Jesus and can sit lightly to your possessions and use them in the right way that will find real life. And the conclusion of the story about Zacchaeus, what does he say? Jesus said to him, "Today salvation has come to this house, because this man too is a son of Abraham." This man's no longer separated from God. Now, in one sense, physically he's a son of Abraham, right? He's a Jewish man. But what Jesus means, I think, is, Abraham is the great example of faith in the Old Testament. He's the one that trusted God. He's kind of the great example. And the Bible says if we will trust Jesus, trust God through Jesus, that we're kind of spiritually sons and daughters of Abraham. Did you notice Jesus says, "Today I must stay at your house"? And then verse 9, he says to Zacchaeus, "Today salvation has come to this house." Where Jesus is, there's the offer of salvation. So what were those three things that Zacchaeus learned that are available to anyone who will trust Jesus? Acceptance by God, forgiveness, and beginning to get life in order because Jesus is our Lord. I'm actually going to give you the opportunity to pray a prayer. If you know that you need to sort things out with God, if you know that you need forgiveness, if you know that you're out of relationship with God but you want to find forgiveness through Jesus, let me tell you the kind of prayer that you need to pray. It'll be on the screen. What I'll do is I'll read through it, and then actually I'm going to pray it, invite you to pray it with me. Dear God, I admit I've not treated you as I should. I've lived with other things at the centre of my life and not you, the one who gives me life. Please forgive me because Jesus died in my place. Please help me to live with Jesus as my Lord and to trust him in all parts of my life, to bring them under his control. Amen. Is that something you want to do? If you'll trust Jesus with this, God promises to forgive and that we can actually know him. I'm going to pray it sentence by sentence, and I invite you in the privacy of your own heart to pray this to God as well. So I'll give you a moment, I'll pause for a moment, and then I'm going to pray this through. If you'd like to speak to God, he's ready to listen. Pray after me if you'd like to. Dear God, I admit I've not treated you as I should. I've lived with other things at the centre of my life and not you, the one who gives me life. Please forgive me because Jesus died in my place. Please help me to live with Jesus as my Lord and to trust him in all parts of my life, to bring them under his control. Amen. If you've prayed that prayer, you can be sure that God has heard you and that God will forgive you. It'd be a great help to talk to someone who's been Christian, who's been following Jesus for a while, and talk with them about how to get started in following Jesus and living that out. If you'd like to, you can contact us at City Bible Forum via our website, and we'll see if we can be of any assistance to you.